Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens Let's Talk Gardens, a webinar series where we engage with ideas, tips, tricks, everything to be able to help you learn how to turn your brown thumb green. So with us today, we have a houseplant expert, which is great because it's not great weather where he is right now. But as usual, please put your questions in the chat box. We will answer as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. I'm Cindy Brown. I am the Manager of Education, Collections, and Access at Smithsonian Gardens, and we are delighted to have you join us today. And I'm even more delighted to have us being joined by Darryl Cheng, who is our speaker and is going to help us with houseplants. This is something that we all need help with at this time of the year. I'm sure many of us have bought tropicals in that we're trying to keep alive, or we have interior plants that we're trying to keep alive as well. And Darryl, I am going to disappear, let you take over this presentation and tell us all about houseplants, and then I'll come back on at the end of the presentation and be able to share the questions that our audience has and share them with you so that you can give us your answers. But I'll be delighted to see your images, and I'm delighted to have some help with my houseplants. And I don't know if you can hear them in the background, but they're all going, yay, Cindy's going to get help with houseplants. So thank you
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
much. Yeah, I'll see you in a bit. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Cindy. And also thanks, Zach, for managing all the questions. So hello, everyone. My name is Darryl Cheng. I'm the author of The New Plant Parent and the creator of the blog and Instagram account Houseplant Journal. So let me share the screen. Yeah, and so in today's presentation, is called An Engineer's Approach to Houseplant Care. And so you're probably wondering, well, what does an engineer have to do with talking about houseplant care? So today, I'm going to go over a little bit about how I started Houseplant Journal, just kind of like how it all started. And overall, in the whole presentation, I'm going to kind of allude to like the way that engineers approach things and help you understand that it's about creating systems of how to understand how something works, and of course, lots of and also setting realistic expectations. And the key lessons I hope you'll get from this presentation are number one, the Houseplant Journal approach to houseplant care, which I'll kind of detail what that is exactly. Get some insights on how light behaves indoors. And lastly, watering strategies. And I use the word strategy in particular because I think it'll help you have a better understanding of how it all works. So how did all this begin? Well, a couple of years ago, well, more than a couple now, I was still living at home with my mom, and she said, "Hey, Darryl, help me decorate the house with some houseplants." And I said, "Sure." And she also added, "But you have to figure out how to take care of them," because she claimed to be bad with plants, which this was confusing to me because she taught me how to do outdoor gardening. We had annuals and perennials and sometimes had vegetables. So I thought, Mom, how come you're not good with indoor plants? And she just fell back to this narrative of, oh, I kill everything or I have a black thumb when it comes to indoor plants. So I did like any millennial would and just bought a bunch of plants and went on Google to try and figure out how to do it. So here you can see when it's nighttime, I put together these what are called ladder shelves. And it doesn't look very nice at night, but fortunately we have a big skylight that allowed a lot of this beautiful indirect light to come in. And you can see that it also is the secret to nice looking photo, and that is having nice.
Hi, Darryl. We're having problems with your presentation. Here we practiced ahead of time, had no problems at all. But you have now frozen, so I'm going to suggest that perhaps you stop and start again and see if that will make a difference. I know Darryl's having work done on his house today with installing some windows. So I'm wondering if he's having a problem with window installation. So hopefully he'll get back on. And this is something we always dread. And we were laughing that we haven't had too many problems. And I even knocked on wood, and that didn't do any good at all to be able to do it, to be able to not jinx us to go along with it. But Darryl does have he's a professional blogger, so hopefully he'll figure out what's going on and be able to come back on. So while we're waiting, I thought I would give you some information about what's going on at Smithsonian Gardens. At Smithsonian Gardens right now, it doesn't look quite like it does back behind me. This is an image that is a glass lantern slide. I don't know if many of you know, but in addition to our gardens in the greenhouse, we do have an archives, and it's called the Archives of American Gardens. And it is our pleasure to be able to hold these this collection so that we can keep track of all the trends and all the cultural connections and all kinds of things to be able to are shown in these images, because the images do a great job to show what was popular at the time. These images started out back in the late 1800s with the glass lantern slides, and now of course we're getting all digital born images. But this is one that was given to us in through the Garden Club of America collection, and it probably was taken back in the 1920s, but I just thought it was apropos for this time of the year. And we do have it on our website to be able to share with people as it comes on board. Well, I'm really hoping that we are going to get Darryl back on. I'm hoping the people that did the work on the house have not broken his internet connection, which would really be a first for us. But I promise, if if I jinxed us by saying we don't have too many problems and Darryl can't get back on, we'll be able to have them come back on at a different time. So the question is, how do we get Darryl's blog? If you go to houseplantjournal.com, I'm pretty sure it's .com, it's either .com or .org, you would be able to find Darryl and his blog. He does all types of presentations. Oh good, Zach got it up for us, it was .com. Thank you, Zach. So it is a terrific blog to be able to learn more about houseplants, especially for the different types of things that he does, and has a little bit more information about. I am going to check my email just in case he has tried to contact me and let me know that there's something crazy going on. Don't see anything crazy, so we're going to have to just wait a little bit longer and see if he can jump on or not. Again, I apologize. You never know when something is going to happen in this digital world. Here he is. So he got disconnected, and hopefully he'll be able to get back on. I'm going to tell him to please reconnect, and I'll let you in. I'll let you in. I'm a terrible typist, so I can't imagine what is coming out of this. So there he is. All right.
Hello.
All right. I was filling in. I didn't sweat too much. You can't see any beads of sweat on my head. But Zach, not Zach, Darryl, I promised him that we would have you back if you couldn't get connected. So now you have 9 extra minutes. People plan on staying on for 9 extra minutes at the end. We'll stop at
all right.
All right. I'm disappearing again. Go for it.
Okay. Let me get back to the sharing. Oh wait, I'm going to share the whole screen instead. Okay, recording, good, everything's good. Okay, so where did I leave off? I think I left off with just, starting to take a bunch of houseplants and trying to figure out how to take care of them myself.
Yeah, so you were saying your mother had a brown thumb, which many of us do.
Right.
So, yes, thank you.
And yes, and I think to emphasize the confusing part, which was she knew how to do outdoor plants, and we had vegetables and perennials and a nice garden, but for some reason indoors was kind of she was very scared about it, right? And I think a lot of people are. So anyway, that's how I began Houseplant Journal, which was literally just to journal about my houseplants. That's why the title may seem a little redundant. But one thing that I was really interested in doing was time-lapse videos. And so I'm going to show you a couple here by smoothly switching to some of my time-lapse videos. So here's a little fiddle leaf fig bud coming out, and it was only through doing time-lapse videos that I realized that sometimes the fiddle leaf fig can grow 2 or 3 leaves, in the same go, and that was really something fascinating to be able to witness. Yeah, and just go through another one here. Everyone's favorite, Monstera deliciosa. The thing with time-lapse videos that's interesting is that humans we experience our moments in seconds and minutes, but for plants, their moments are really more like days and weeks. So with time-lapse videos, I can compress days and weeks into just a few seconds, and that's what you're seeing right before your eyes. So here, what always seems to look like it takes forever, like the Monstera leaf one day is a little bit out, and the next day you look and it's a little bit more, and maybe you forgot about it after a week, and oh wow, it's starting to really open now. And so time-lapse videos has really allowed me to just kind of share and also experience, what plants are doing when they seem to be just sitting there. So let's just do one more for fun here. Everyone always says that snake plants take forever. And well, yes, it is true that it takes a while for them to push out a new leaf. But when that new leaf emerges, then the growing process takes, this is roughly 80 days worth of footage. So you're seeing, yeah, basically a couple of months go by watching this leaf grow from a tiny baby to the full size, as you see here. So that's the fascinating stuff with plants. But when it comes to how people talk about plant care, I think memes and comics tend to kind of capture people's general sentiment about plants. So here's one that I really like from Bunny comic. Bunny goes and buys a nice plant, and they're all excited about it. And putting the face on the plant is here for a good reason, because then you bring the plant home and it comes and looks at all these sad-looking plants. Or here's another one where people think, oh yeah, I want to make a really big lush jungle, but then the reality is that maybe some plants are browning leaves, other ones have yellowing leaves, and unfortunately, sometimes it seems like everything just doesn't look as nice as when you first got it. Or another one where we talk about how houseplants are, oh, they're going to make you feel good about life, maybe in general. But so you buy a bunch of plants, and sometimes it feels even worse when they start to not look so nice. Last two here, just how it started, how it's going, fiddle leaf fig. I think a lot of people have experienced this with their fiddle leaf figs. Or here, this last one is just I like this one because it's like, oh, you see a really nice looking plant. Well, I know it's new only because it looks like you just brought it home. So are we sort of like locked into this inevitable disappointment when it comes to houseplants? I mean, I've pulled out so many examples of these memes, and I haven't seen that many that maybe share the opposite, right? So in the chat, maybe you could put down what are some of the traditional tips and tricks that you've heard about how to take care of houseplants. So just to say it again, like put in the chat box the typical tips and tricks that you've heard about how to take care of houseplants. And I'm just going
So
to
this is
open
almost
this.
like a reverse poll. We'll hear from you rather than creating one and letting you
Yeah.
vote. It's going to work. So you tell us what you think people are sharing good information.
Hmm.
Darryl, are you going to tell us differently? Hopefully, hopefully
Well,
not.
I'm gonna clarify some of these things, but yeah. So the very traditional ones that I'm seeing a lot of is don't overwater. Maybe you need to mist your plants, rotate your pot regularly, bright indirect light, no ice cubes. That's a good one. Keep humidity high, give it indirect light. Yeah, these are all typical things that people have essentially recycled over decades of having houseplants, right? And you know my engineering mind has come to this. It's come to thinking like, if these are the things that people are saying to do, and yet we have meme after meme of people feeling like plants are always disappointing, maybe there's something in the way that houseplant care is taught that is not quite clicking with people. So anyway, thank you all for your contribution there. But anyway, so I'm gonna kind of say here about what I think of traditional tips and tricks. So I'm going to break it down into what people say to do, and then how it's interpreted, and kind of derive like what's the underlying belief here. So you've all already said all these things: don't overwater, bright indirect light, avoid direct sun. Sometimes they'll diagnose plants looking at their leaves and say, if it's yellow leaves, maybe it's overwatering. And if it's brown tips, you probably need to raise the humidity. And I think the way that that's interpreted is that if the plant doesn't look perfect, you think you're doing something wrong. And if it doesn't look as nice as the day you first bought it, people they blame themselves and say they're a plant killer. And so the underlying belief, I think, is people believe that proper care, and of course I'm using the air quotes here, proper care somehow should equal perfect plants forever. But for me, I think that there's something to be enjoyed about houseplants in the way that they grow, and also realizing that they are their own living thing that have survived, eons of evolution and all this, and basically being on Earth a lot longer than we have, right? So the traditional, again, as I mentioned, is that people believe that leaves tell you when something's wrong, or the converse of this is, uh, if everything is right, quote unquote, then the plant should be perfect forever. And to me, this is a perfection driven approach, which only leads to worry and disappointment. But I'm going to give you some, a different set of core beliefs about houseplant care, and that is that leaves have a limited lifespan. They're not supposed to live indefinitely. And so the goal, therefore, is to optimize. You want the plant to grow more than it decays. So that way you will always have a nice leafy plant, knowing that those are new leaves and the older ones have died off. And finally, to accept change, and also realizing that the way a plant looks is very subjective. Like, you could think one plant looks nice, whereas someone else may say, "Oh, I don't like the long stem here. I prefer it to, close and compact." And just realizing that the look of a plant is a very subjective judgment. And I think when you take this approach, then you'll feel like it's more holistic, and also ultimately more rewarding when you have plants that have grown with you for a long time. And so, just to keep up with the example from the previous slide, Dracaena marginata, one day I went and pulled off all these yellowed leaves, and under a traditional thinking, you might think, oh, something must therefore be wrong if it's losing these leaves. But clearly, you can see that, well, I don't know if you can see clearly, but every line on this trunk is actually the scar of a leaf that has fallen off before. And so then now you look at the whole trunk and realize, oh, that means this plant has gone through a lot of leaves, and they've pretty much just fallen off and new ones grow at the top. And that's just the way that the plant grows. And to go farther than this and say, well, look, if I go to a conservatory where, you know, we would presume that the conditions would be ideal and there's professional staff to take care of them. And yet yellow leaves and brown tips still happen to these plants. So maybe the leaf turnover idea is perhaps the norm rather than an indication that something is necessarily wrong. And so, just to show you a few more examples from my own collection here, rabbit's foot fern is actually one of my favorites, although some people may not like it because it looks a little bit like, tarantula legs. maybe if they called this tarantula fern, I'm not sure people would actually like it. But anyway, it's one of my favorite ferns, and you can see when I first potted it up here, it's nice and newly potted, and then 2 years later, we've got an explosion. Like, I mean, only because you're looking at the two pictures side by side. But throughout the 2 years, I can tell you that every few weeks I'm pulling off some of these dead and dried up fronds. And so that is to say that this plant has been growing with me for 2 years, constantly losing leaves, but clearly growing more as well. And my own profile picture here, the staghorn fern that I mounted, and which is right here behind me, 5 years later, has grown quite a lot. And in fact, I had to remount it to another board. But all the leaves that were on this plant when I first got it, all these fronds are all gone. Another plant that people are really kind of raving about, the Monstera Thai constellation. This is what it looks like, just this last year. And I've had it since 2018. Now, the thing with these three pictures in particular is to realize that if you're looking at this leaf here, this yellowing one here, it is the oldest leaf. And in 2019, this picture, it was the newest leaf. And in 2018, all these, these kind of progenitor leaves, they're all gone. So the idea that leaves have a limited lifespan is really more like when they start turning yellow, they start to the plant is actually removing the salvageable mobile nutrients, mostly nitrogen, and sending it up to the newer growth. So when I see a yellowing leaf on, it has to be the oldest leaf as well on the plant, then I really think of it more like a leaf retirement process, right? And so when the leaf turns fully yellow, and you can probably just pull it off on some plants, then I kind of say to it, thank you for your contribution to photosynthesis, because since 2019, this little leaf has been faithfully producing carbohydrates for the plant to produce all these nice big leaves that we really love, right? So the leaf turnover idea is really key to understanding, and I think would also help to alleviate a lot of fears. Yeah, so I'm just circling here that all of these leaves that are in the green square, they're all dead and gone, and the plant is still completely fine. So earlier when I talked about optimizing growth over decay, then clearly we need to, like, if we're having to accept that inevitably older leaves will die, then how do we get as many new leaves to come out as possible? Well, it all starts with having good light. And this is what I call the most important factor, and yet it is the least understood. And I think one of the reasons it's least understood is because people are using a overly simplified system. They say, oh, bright indirect light, maybe they say high, medium, and low, as if your feeling could tell you to help you judge the light. Or they make some broad categorizations about each different type of window, right? But again, for an engineer, for me, this is too vague. And the reason it's too vague is because there's no objective or measurable meaning to any of these things, so that when we're trying to communicate with people, like what type of light we have, then if it doesn't have any objective and concrete thing, then you could say, oh, I have an east facing window. And then you say, and then someone else says, oh, they also have an east facing window. But does that mean we have anything close to the same? Well, I'll show you, not necessarily the case. So what happens when we're vague about things? Then we just say, well, it's bright indirect light. And you say, what does that even mean? bright and direct light. Uh, this is the from the show Schitt's Creek, where Moira Rose tries to explain to her son, what does it mean to fold in the cheese? And she just keeps saying, you just fold it in. And so, anyway, the point is, what happens when instructions are vague? They are easily misinterpreted. So, I have seen many plant questions where people show me a plant and they say, "Hey, what's wrong with this plant?" And all they're showing me is the plant itself. And then I say, "Well, then, how long have you had the plant? Number one, and number two, can you show me where you put the plant?" And I don't want to just say, like, not just telling me where do you put it, but show me. And they say, "Oh, it's near an east-facing window." And I look at the plant and it's like 15 feet from the window. Or I made sure it's not getting direct sun, and it is again way off to the side from a window. Another one is they read the label and it says, oh, it does well in shade. And again, it's far from the window. I have it in bright indirect light, again, way off to the side from a window. And the point of showing you this is to say that if intelligent, well-meaning people are reading instructions and this is what they interpret, and yet the results of their plants is that they're disappointed, then it's a signal that not that these people need to read more or something. It's a signal that the system that they're trying to use to understand light is a poor system. And so that's why I say the famous last words heard by many houseplants is bright indirect light. Well, this spot seems bright enough. And on the other hand, we have we have people who, okay, you have a pothos and someone else has a pothos, and for some reason, why does theirs look so much nicer, right? And we made this idea that, oh, it's because they have a green thumb, and as if it's some magical power. But I'm going to tell you that the people who you think have the greenest thumbs are likely the people who have large and unobstructed windows. That's really the simplest answer I can give. And so to help you understand this, like here I'm using Photoshop to show like a pixelation of me holding a plant. And you can see that when we're really kind of rough with the resolution, this is equivalent to giving, very basic and simple guidelines, right? But not much detail. Next is we're getting a bit more detailed. We're going to start talking about how to measure light and understand what it means for the plant. And lastly is raw data collection. That is, for me as an engineer, I'm trying to get the most detailed picture of how light behaves indoors in order to make good, simple guidelines. So I'm actually going to start with the raw data collection. Yeah, but before I go into this, I want to say that none of you needs to do this yourselves. The point is I'm doing this really detailed calculation and measurement so that eventually when I give you the simple guideline, it makes sense. So how exactly did I do this? You can see on my shelf here, I have two little devices that are clamped to the shelf. And these are what are called data logging light sensors. So I set them to measure the light every 5 minutes, and I just put them there for 2 weeks. So that way, having two of them at the same time means that I'm negating the effect of different weather patterns, and I just want to figure out how much is how different is the light only 2 feet farther into the room. So that you can see the first one here is right up near the window, and the next one is just on the other side of the shelf. And so, yeah, that's the collecting of the light data. And the other thing I'm doing is called shading analysis. And what that means is, this is a concept from architecture. When you're in a specific spot in a room, then the shading analysis is like saying, okay, if I imagine like a dome around me, where am I exposed to the sky and where am I covered from the sky? And then also, where's the path of the sun relative to where I'm standing in the room? And if you look at this, I'm just kind of toggling back and forth between being close to the window and farther. Well, that really affects the angle of visible sky that's available to you. And therefore, um, not only the surface area that's visible to the sky, but also the path of the sun. The less obstruction you have, the more path of the sun that you may have depending on the direction you're facing. Okay, so that's from my particular room, overlaid with a map of how the sun moves for those 2 weeks that I was doing the measurement. And so what light intensity data did I collect over those 2 weeks? Well, we can make sense of why this graph looks the way it does because, okay, this spike here happens between 9 and 10, and clearly that's because between 9 and 10, the sun is in our direct line of sight. Then when the sun progresses throughout the rest of the day, it's occluded by the ceiling. And so the rest of the day, all these squiggly lines down here represent the brightness of that patch of the sky, right? So that's for the data close to the window. Now, I told you I had a second one farther from the window, and I think intuitively we know there is less, but as an engineer, I want to know exactly how much less. That's the graph that I get from the sensor farther from the window. And so just to help you appreciate, let me just toggle between the two sensors. And so again, let's make sense of this second graph here, right? Like, why don't I see the same spike at 9 and 10? Well, because when I'm farther into the room, the other building that's outside of my building occludes the sun from 9 and 10. So in fact, all of these squiggly lines is only the result of having whatever patch of visible sky I have from 2 feet farther into the window, or sorry, 2 feet farther from the window. And then the other thing, which is also really important to note, is that the height of all these squiggly lines, that is the indirect light, the height of this line is quite a lot less than just being closer to the window, which means that that patch of visible sky being reduced to the smaller angle when you're farther from the window has a profound impact on the brightness, the strength of indirect light. All right, so now just putting these two side by side, again, asking the question exactly how much less, we have to use something called the daily light integral, which, if you remember from calculus, is just the area underneath a curve. So what I did was, for each of these graphs, I just took the average area under every one of these curves and averaged it out over the 2 weeks. And so the number we get for close to the window is 1.48 moles per day. Don't worry about the units, just we're going to always use the same number here, like the same unit for the DLI, daily light integral. So 1.48, that's what this is the representation of the average area underneath all these curves here. When I'm doing the DLI calculation for farther from the window, I get 0.25 moles per day. And if I divide them, that's a ratio of 5.9. So it's almost 6 times less light. All I'm doing is I'm moving farther, 2 feet farther into the room. And so what if you have bigger windows? Like my friend here, he's got these big loft windows. Again, intuitively, you know it's more, but I'm asking exactly how much more. And he allowed me to do the same experiment in his home, putting the sensors in his room for 2 weeks. And this is the graph that I get. And of course, I'm cutting it off at the same light level as the previous graphs, just so you can appreciate the difference. And so exactly how much more? Well, his DLI for those 2 weeks is almost 14. Now remember, my little window was 1.48. And moving on, also, what about a nursery? We know that plants grow well at nurseries because that's clearly where they're commercially produced. So I asked my nursery owner friend, "Hey, can I put my sensor here in your nursery for 2 weeks?" And he said, "Sure." And this is the data that I collected for nursery grown plants. Again, the shading analysis clearly we're showing like everything is open except we're having a, a diffusing cloth in front, and this darker cloth here is called a shade cloth, which commercial growers always use that. Um, the way that they grow their plants is that if you imagine that the roof is not just totally open, but rather it's shaded by different layers of shade cloth, of course, depending on what type of plant you're growing. So that's the data that I collected from the nursery over a 2-week period, and their DLI was almost 8.7. Again, to remind you, my little window is 1.48. So the reason that people's plants can look so different is because their light situations can be very different, even if it doesn't feel that way. But when you actually measure it, then the numbers tell you that it's could be 10 times more even, right? So just appreciating, all the 4 areas that I was able to collect the data for, just even if I didn't tell you the DLI or the area under these curves, you can just look at it and realize, oh, it's quite different depending on where you are. Excuse me. And so the size of the window, the distance from the window, they all have a significant impact on the light, even if it doesn't feel that way, because our human eyes, our human perception system actually was not meant to measure and detect minute differences in light levels. In fact, it's the complete opposite. Our eyes and perception system are meant to normalize everything so it feels similar, because we're meant to identify objects. We're meant to say, like, whether it's a bear coming after us, or if I can eat this, or if I'm attracted to that. Like, that's the reason we can see things. The reason we see things is not to generate carbohydrates. And so for plants, they need us to understand that the way that they experience light is completely different than how we experience light. And so I also wanted to bring up this point, because then people are saying, well, what about plants that do well in quote unquote low light? And I think this was a miscommunication between horticulturalists and interior designers. See, when a horticulturalist describes a place that is low light, what they are saying is that there's very few hours where the sun is completely unobstructed. So such a place would be like under the canopy of a forest. But interior designers go ahead and think, oh, that means it's just anywhere where the sun doesn't shine. But if I block out every place that is opaque on these 2 shading analysis pictures, well, then you can see that under a forest canopy is completely not the same as being, far from your window. So that means, I think we should really think of it more like the term thrives in low light really just means that maybe that plant, meaning snake plant, pothos, ZZ plant, dracaenas, they just die slower and less noticeably than other plants. And so, after all that, what simple guidelines can I give you based on having seen such detailed information? Well, any plant that has the instruction, quote unquote, bright indirect light, what you want to give it is you're considering the surroundings of the plant as a hashtag. That's what my plant sees, as if it had eyes all around it. You want to maximize the view of the sky. So you put it where it'll have the widest possible view of the sky. That's step 1. And then step 2 is only if the duration where the sun is, right in your line of sight, if that exceeds 2 or 3 hours, and of course the tolerance varies by plant, if that exceeds 2 or 3 hours, then you might consider blocking it with a white sheer curtain. So I want to contrast this with what bright indirect light does not mean. It does not mean that anywhere in the room is fine, because as we saw, when you put it as close to the window as possible, you're getting the best possible light. And that doesn't mean that you need to avoid direct sun entirely. It means you want to avoid prolonged exposure. And quite often I say that, if you have a very large window that the sun peers in for hours a day, it's not necessarily that the sun cooked your plants. It's that you weren't able to keep up with watering, or it was difficult to keep up with the watering. And so when you realize that, oh, if my plant is photosynthesizing more, it's almost like the engine is running more. And so you need to replenish the fuel tank, which is the water. Uh, and it also means, it does not mean that people have similar light situations, because as we saw, that the window size, the degree of obstruction, the precise distance that someone places their plant from the window, they all have a profound impact that you can't really feel all that easily. And so here, I'm going to now move up a step from just the simple guidelines and introduce you to this table from my website, houseplantjournal.com, or even if you just Google light requirements by plant, it usually will bring up my website first. And so what I'm going to do here is teach you how to use this this table. So but teach you based on having seen, now that you've seen these very detailed measurements, like how do we understand when I say that the plant can survive with this, or grow well with that, and then the tolerance for direct sun. You have to remember that in any spot from a window, you can either have the sun shining on you or not, meaning the sun is elsewhere. So just consider those two general states, right? And if I was to simplify what I'm doing with this graph, it's that, okay, I'm just going to take a very general tally of how long the sun is actually in my line of sight from that spot, and then look at, for example, Chinese evergreen, and it says that the tolerance for direct sun is roughly 1 to 2 hours. And so from this spot, yes, I'm getting roughly 1 to 2 hours, which means I don't really need to block it with a curtain. And then at other times of the day, I'm going to measure. And of course, you can see that all these lines are very squiggly, but if you measure it at somewhere in here, it's going to be between 1 and 200, maybe 300 foot candles. So then I go to this graph and it says, okay, well, Chinese evergreen will grow well if your indirect light is above 200. So then great, if I put my Chinese evergreen here, I can expect it to grow pretty well. Now, what if I move it farther into the room? I do the same analysis. So am I getting any direct sun from here? You probably have to look at it for a couple of days to realize that no, the sun never actually touches this spot. So no, I'm not getting any direct sun. So I don't need to even worry about this tolerance of direct sun. But then this second part here, which is really correlated to the total visible area of the sky, I take my light meter, I measure it, and I'm getting in the neighborhood of 90 foot candles. Well, then I go to this and I see that the Chinese evergreen will kind of just, barely maintain itself at 100 foot candles. So then, if I wanted to leave the plant here, I can't expect it to grow all that well. I mean, it won't die right away. And in fact, it may not die ever, but I think the long-term shape of the plant may not be as pleasing. And I'm just generalizing here because, people generally like nice compact plants. So, but the point is, because I've measured, now I have some more concrete way to manage my expectations of how well, Chinese evergreen will grow there. So again, like if you go to the website, the table is listed all there with a lot of different plants. And the point is, this is something that I wanted to help people to have some sort of concrete way to assess, number one, how close do they need to put their plants to the window? And number two, how well can they expect it to grow? Yeah, and so that's sort of, as much as I can say about light, and that in the simple guidelines, the best possible light that you want is going to be as close to your windows as possible. And I think also realizing that, nobody has the same size windows and nobody puts their plants exactly in the same positions. Therefore, it's hard to expect our plants to look exactly like someone else's if they've had them for a long time. And then if you want to go up a step, you get yourself a light meter, something like this. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Light meter, uh, and then measure the strength of the indirect light, and then take note of how long the direct sun shines on the plant, and then refer to the list of plants to sort of like get a better sense of how well your plant will grow. And lastly, this raw data collection, I don't expect any of you to need to do this, but the point is, this is the way that you would really get a clear picture of your light situation, and realizing that it can be very different. You saw that from even different weather patterns, it changes the level of light, obviously. And just little, what seems to be small changes in position from the window makes a big difference. Okay, so all that about light. Let's talk about watering. Sometimes when I post a picture showing, all the plants that I have, this was actually in a previous apartment that I was at, they wonder, like, how often do you water this plant, or how do you keep track of all these plants? And to that I say, there's nothing to keep track of, because the way that I approach watering is just to look at the soil, and it tells me when to water the plant. And so an analogy I think that would be helpful here is to say, okay, if you have a car, how do you determine when you put gas in it, right? Uh, Even if I told you I have a Honda Civic and I put gas in it once a week, you know that that doesn't mean that if you also have a Honda Civic, that therefore you should also put gas in it once a week. Like, we know that's not how it works, right? Um, there's all different types of ways that people would determine when to put gas, but basically it's whenever it needs, right? So we could say that the rationale for putting gas in a car is, given that you are using it, meaning driving, then you just put gas in it whenever it needs. And so the analogous concept for plants is, given that there is adequate light, then you water it whenever it needs. And so when you approach watering this way, you don't have to remember when you last watered, because the plant is doing its work, photosynthesizing, and so you just replenish its water whenever it needs. Now, whenever it needs, of course, varies by plant type, but I'm going to kind of impress upon you that there's really only 3 broad categories that you need to look at your soil to know when to water. And that is, for cacti and succulents, you wait until the soil is bone dry, completely dry, before you water it again. And then most house plants, tropical foliage plants, aeroids and Hoyas and all these nice things, they're generally in this partially dry category. So that means, you don't want to let it get all the way to bone dry, and yet you're not trying to keep the soil moist all the time. That's partially dry. And then the last one is keep evenly moist. And a lot of ferns are in this category, but the most notable example is maidenhair fern, which maybe some of you have experienced this. You buy the maidenhair fern, you're afraid not to overwater it, but then you wait, maybe one extra day before you water it again. But then by then it's already, totally brown into a crisp, right? So maidenhair fern is one of those plants where you cannot let its soil reach halfway dry. You have to keep it evenly moist, which is why it's called keep evenly moist. So the way that I would make sure that this doesn't happen is, literally every single day I go and lift up the pot to sort of feel what the weight is. And because you can get a sense for how saturated soil is based on how heavy it is, right? So that's one way to check this. And the other way would also just be to probe around with the chopstick, and you can feel what moist soil feels like versus completely dry soil, right? So that's why some people say you use a moisture meter and all this, but generally there's only the 3 broad categories that you need to pay attention to, and it's easy enough to feel these just from either a chopstick or by lifting the pot. And of course, the really key thing here, which is why I spent most of my time talking about light, is because none of these strategies will work unless the plant is doing its work, meaning photosynthesis. So just as a quick example, people look at a plant and after a couple months they're disappointed with it. It looks all like, very, very sad looking. And they might say, oh, maybe it was overwatered. But the problem isn't that you watered it too much or too often. It's that the plant wasn't doing its work in the first place. So even if you use the moisture meter, you have a terracotta pot, nice and draining and everything, even if you wait until, I don't know, for example, a snake plant gets until the point of completely dry, well, the plant can still dry out from evaporation. But when it gets adequate light, the drying of the soil is also driven by photosynthesis. So really, step one is good light. Step two is then you water it and fertilize. And so to realize again that what I'm showing you in this one slide, you can think of any plant that as long as it's planted in the right soil, you just need to look for which type of strategy you should apply to that plant. And I'm going to tell you that most of your plants will be either the completely dry type or the partially dry. And that's it. And if you're doing it based on observation rather than just saying, a strict schedule, then it sort of like releases the burden of having to try and keep track of when you last watered. So you just look at the soil. If it's still wet, don't water it. If it's a snake plant that needs to wait until the soil is completely dry, then wait until the soil is completely dry before you water it again. And then in terms of actually how you do the watering, it's best to water thoroughly and evenly and let the excess water drain away. And so that's why it's really helpful to have drainage holes so that I actually like to take my plants to the sink to do this. You give it a nice, thorough, and even soaking, and then let it sit there for a few minutes so that the extra water drains away. And then that is what I would consider to be well watered. So just to conclude, I just want to give you a quote from my book. It's that you'll have a far greater plant parenthood experience if you deepen your appreciation for how plants work and how they grow, as opposed to simply how they look at any given moment. And so to summarize, I hope you can see houseplant ownership as a rewarding hobby when you realize that leaves have a limited lifespan and that your goal is to optimize growth over decay and accept change and realizing that the way a plant looks is subjective. So if it looks nice to you, then that's really all that matters. And I hope you also got some clarity on light and watering with some improved systems of understanding of how to get the best possible light and thinking of watering as strategies rather than strict schedules that are based on any specific plant. So yeah, that's all I want to say. My book is The New Plant Parent, and I'm on these social media platforms as Houseplant Journal.
Darryl, thank you. That was terrific. I really appreciate the engineering look at light because that's something that I was taught a long time ago. You get out your light sensor and you go by that. And we do know that we're supposed to turn our light or turn our plants even if they're in a window, just because some of the sides are not going to be exposed all the time. But
Mhm.
something you didn't talk about that we're getting asked about is fertilizer. And also, if you don't have the perfect light, what can you do to supplement the light? And you can see them all pop up too. I know you're watching
Mhm.
the chat as well. So
Right.
those are questions, and also different light in different seasons. But I think if you use your light sensor, you're going to know that there's different light in different seasons. So that's
Mhm.
okay. But how about fertilizer and supplemental light?
Right. So when I think of a plant, again, back to the whole engineering thing, is I look at it like it's a little solar powered sugar factory, right? That's really what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to take the analogy further, the the sugars that are created out of mixing carbon dioxide and water, those are like little cookies, let's say, right? But the building itself, like the meaning the plant structures themselves, they need other things to get them to grow, right? The cookie is just the raw energy, right? The same way we eat and it's raw energy, but the formation of the plant structures themselves requires what are called macro and micronutrients. I
Mhm.
think there's 17 of them. And the big ones, the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, are usually the first, like the three numbers that they designate a fertilizer.
Right.
It's just the ratio, right?
Mhm.
So since I'm growing houseplants, again, I want to make sure we're talking about only foliage houseplants, then I really only care that the leaves look nice. I'm not trying to get them to flower. I don't need a fruit out of them. I just want them to like exist and look nice. So then I would use a high nitrogen fertilizer. So 3:1:2 is generally the ratio that I'm looking for. And I literally use that on every single plant that I have, only because I'm only dealing with ornamental houseplants. Um, and then in terms of when I use it, I think there's a lot of advice that says, don't fertilize in winter and all that. But that advice comes more from outdoor gardening when there is true dormancy in the winter,
Mhm.
right? So yes, if you have, I don't know, let's say hibiscus, it was blooming all nice through the winter, in the summer and fall, and then you bring it in and give it a nice, pruning to kind of wait until the next time you bring it outside. Well, then yes, don't fertilize that. But because I'm growing like monsteras and snake plants and staghorn ferns that are inside, they're inside all the time. Uh, they don't experience the drop in temperature and therefore the uh, slowdown of their metabolism. So sometimes you'll see, or actually quite often, new leaves popping out from your plants in the middle of winter. And in that case, you should be fertilizing them because they are asking for those nutrients when they're putting out new growth. So for me, to keep it simple, I literally just put fertilizer in my water anytime I water. And that's kind of, I know it's a little bit of a no-brainer approach, but that's just what I do because I don't want to think about, whether this one's growing, whether it's not. They're all growing because it's always, what is it, Fahrenheit, 70 Fahrenheit inside. Like I think of it in
It's
22 or
Celsius, yeah.
24 Celsius. Yeah.
Yeah. We haven't told anybody you're in Toronto, so you're
Yes.
using a different metric system and as well. But your information and advice is exactly what our tropical plant team would tell everyone as well. They say don't switch up your fertilizing habits. If anything, you reduce them just on a every all use habit, I should say, because usually they are recommending more fertilizer than what you need on a plant label. But Matt
Mm,
and Justin, who's taking care of our orchids, would say, I just fertilize all the time so I don't forget. I'm in the habit and I just do it. And that's what I'm
mm,
going to do. So those are our tropical plant specialists compared to our outdoor specialists. And just like you say, if the plant's going dormant, it's not going to be producing new leaves, so don't do it.
mm.
Good thing we're doing the right thing. I like that. How about then light? And we're going to go a little bit over 1 o'clock, everyone. So if you can stay, thank you. If not, please visit Darryl's website, and I'm sure he'll be able to tell you more information as well. So
Mhm.
how about supplemental light?
Yes. So earlier I talked about a concept called daily light integral, right? And that is sort of like the ultimate understanding of the question, how much light do I get? And so the when you take a light meter, you're really just measuring analogous to, let's say, speed, like the speed of a car at that moment. But then the total distance, you have to know how long have I been traveling at that speed, right? So the equivalent is you measure the light, that's your speed. Then how long do you keep the light on? That's your DLI. Well, the DLI you have to, calculate it with a lot of different conversions, but basically that's the concept, right? So if I have a grow light, I have to make sure that number one, I put it close enough and measure so that I know that it's strong enough. Because I see sometimes people say, "Oh, it's under fluorescent light. The light is in the ceiling. It's way too far, right?" So anyway, number one is you still have to measure the light, and number two is then, like without getting into actually having to calculate, let's just say on the safe side, it's got to be left on for 8 to 12 hours. Some people go even up to 16 hours, right? If you just turn it on for 4 hours a day, and I mean it's barely gonna help, right? The concept of total distance matters, right? If I'm traveling at 60 miles an hour, but I'm only doing that for 1 minute, that doesn't really take you very far, right? So in general, 8 to 12 hours, and measure the strength of that light. You want it to be, I'm gonna broadly generalize again, you want it to be somewhere in the 200 to 400 foot candle range. That will be really good for any bright indirect light sort of plant. It's not enough for cacti. It's not enough for succulents. You're still going to get stretching, even if you're, you know, 800-foot candles for 16 hours. It's, your succulent still may not do as well.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's like I'm only scratching the surface of the different effects of different light and duration and DLI, but effectively it's that, um, yeah, you can certainly use grow lights and using them 8 to 12 hours a day, close enough to the plant, it should be generally okay.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. And we're getting questions about fertilizer. And we can't name brands, but I can tell you, use any type of fertilizer you have. That's not going to smell up your house, for one. I know I've used some of the more organic fertilizers inside, and my cats adore it, but I did not as much. So use whatever you have. But what I'm also going to tell you is we'll bring Darryl back if he agrees, because he has another presentation on the types of plants he recommends. So rather than answer all the different questions about the types of plants that you use or what you recommend for low light, high light, how about you come back? We'll bring you back in a couple months, and then you can give people ideas, or go to Darryl's website and he has ideas there too.
Sure, I would love that. Love that. And yeah, thank you again so much. I mean, clearly you can see I love talking about plants and houseplants and all the light, especially. But it's been a real fun, and thank you all so much for your comments and compliments. It's really encouraging.
Well, thank you. And I'm not going to be able to say anymore that we're going to turn your brown thumb green. We're going to say, we'll bring out the engineer in you. How about that? We'll bring out the plant engineer and everyone for our presentations. So,
Mhm.
Darryl, thank you so much for your information. Thank you for sharing it with us. And we look forward to when we can have you come back again to tell us more about houseplants.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone,
all
for
so much.
joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.